see. No, they just set out on their dragnet, grabbing all the data they could see. And Google, Facebook, and AT&T went right along without telling you or me. They can't hide their spying eyes and their smiles have been disguised. I thought by now they'd realize there ain't no way to hide their spying eyes.
Hello, and welcome for joining us on Bill of Rights Day. My name is Chip Gibbons. I am the Policy Director of Defending Rights Dissent. That lovely music was from Mike Ruffo, who is a board member of ours. And if you want to download the song, you can do so at mikerufomusic.com. We have many other talented board members. They will not be singing, but they will be joining us for this panel this evening. So we all know that 2020 has been a very tumultuous year. You may have forgotten this already, but it began with an impeachment trial in the Senate, which was quickly eclipsed by a global pandemic and ended with one of the most contentious elections in recent memory. This year saw renewed outrage over police violence and against racism, with unprecedented protests taking part across the country. These protests against police violence were often met with police violence themselves, including when peaceful protesters gathered at Lafayette Square Park and the Attorney General of the United States had them tear gassed so the president could engage in a press op. And in spite of a news cycle that felt like a tidal wave, we were given no reprieve at Defending Rights and Dissent this year from our long-term fights against surveillance and the prosecution of whistleblowers. These events leave us with rather big questions, and we believe there is no better day to address them than Bill of Rights Day. In 1941, at a time when the world was in the midst of a global depression and locked in a war against fascism, Franklin Delano Roosevelt proclaimed December 15th to be a day set apart as a day of mobilization for freedom and human rights, a day of remembrance for the democratic and peaceful action by which these rights were gained, and a day of reassessment of their present meaning and their living worth. Of course, the 30s and 40s were also a tumultuous time. With the Depression, many people tried to organize against their economic conditions, only to be met with violence by private actors, state actors, and sometimes actors that somehow ran the gauntlet of both state and private. This led the Senate to establish for the first time a Civil Liberties Committee under the leadership of Robert La Follette Jr., and for the Department of Justice to also take up a civil liberties division. During this time, the DOJ resurrected the Reconstruction statutes of the Civil War era to bring back, to prosecute for the first time, a police officer for police brutality at the federal level. And we know that there were struggles against racism during this time. The Scottsboro case captured international attention and went twice to the Supreme Court, and a movement for a march on Washington was proposed by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. They didn't make it to Washington until 20 years later in the 60s when they arrived with a minister named Martin Luther King Jr., but the seeds were planted during this time period. And of course, I would be remiss in not mentioning that while Roosevelt gave a very good speech, a proclamation about Bill of Rights Day, he himself was responsible for a number of civil liberties abuses, including helping to set up the modern surveillance state and Japanese internment. But Bill of Rights Day seems like a great day to have a panel of our expert board members to recall the powerful social movements that have won powerful victories for basic rights, assess the state of the Bill of Rights in 2020, and salute those who continue to defend our Bill of Rights. With that, I will introduce our panel, who I'm very excited to be with. Emily Berman is joining us. She's an associate professor of law at the University of Houston's Law Center. Patrick Eddington is joining us, who is a research fellow at the Cato Institute. He's also an adjunct assistant professor at the university in the Center for Security Studies and the McCourt at Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies and the McCourt School of Public Policy. Shannon L. Wiekel is an attorney whose experiences have combined community lawyering, direct client representation, and public policy advocacy in defense of marginalized communities' rights. She's the managing director of Northwestern University School of Law's Center for Public Interest Advocacy and Collaboration. And we are also joined by Shahid Buttar, who was the executive director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, which merged to create the Defending Rights and Dissent. So thank you all for joining us this evening.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So I guess my first question for all of you I'll open with is, what is the state of the Bill of Rights in 2020?
Start with the softball tip. Well, I think like so many things in this country, the state of the Bill of Rights is sort of uneven. And there are some aspects of the Bill of Rights that are subject to quite vigorous protection. There are others that people seem to conveniently forget from time to time. So I think in some ways, the very nature of the Bill of Rights, that it is these distinct, personal, independent rights, sort of defies talking about them in any sort of unitary way, because at different times in the country's history, and I think today falls into that category as well, you know, different rights have sort of ebbs and flows of how protected they are and how favored they can come to be.
I totally respect your point, Emily, though I would push back constructively. In my view, I'd say the Bill of Rights are, at this point, something between a vestige and an anachronism. You know, I think we all wish they were more meaningful, and certainly the promise that they offer and the written document, they all exist. But the state of at least the ones that are most poignant, I'm thinking here of the First, the Fourth, and the Eighth. So the First Amendment is the right to any number of political rights. We saw how meaningful they are in Portland or Kenosha this summer. The Fourth Amendment is the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. It also includes the right to be free from arbitrary state violence. We see where that's at. The Eighth Amendment is the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. Every person confined in jails and prisons at the moment is at risk of a lethal contagion, which has run rampant across the detention center. So I look at the Bill of Rights as a document that at this point has been reduced to an aspirational set of commitments that we have barely any claim to even have even a vestigial commitment to at this point. I mean, any claim that the Bill of Rights has any actual force in society relies on privilege to make the case, because at least where people have no power, and that was why the Bill of Rights existed, right? The whole point of it is to create rights for people when they don't have political power, counter-majoritarian opportunities to make democracy real. And in those settings where people don't have political power these days, I fear that the Bill of Rights is all but meaningless. All the more important for us to come together on days like this, observe this landscape, and discuss and take action to expand those rights and reclaim rights that we've lost, and help the document and the promises that it represents become more real in the future.
I do think we're at an opportune time to have that conversation about how much we've failed to uphold the Bill of Rights, because, you know, in the last 4 years in particular, the mainstream has become more aware of the potential for authoritarianism in this country. And it's an opportune time for us to talk to the public about what laid the groundwork for these last 4 years, and the fact that for many communities, these type of outrageous abuses of rights were ongoing. They may not have been as visible to the public, but the invasions of privacy, the targeting of communities as suspect communities has been going on for decades, right? And so what was it that allowed that to happen? Was it our complacence about upholding and defending these rights for certain communities, as opposed to those who are well off and privileged and have access?
So I think, you know, when I look at this in kind of the broad history, it's important to remember that it was less than a decade after the Constitution was ratified that we had the first full-on assault on the Bill of Rights, and particularly on the First Amendment and the rights of association, in the form of the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? So one of the things that I try to emphasize to folks whenever I talk about these issues is that there has been a streak of authoritarianism, an anti-democratic streak, essentially, an anti-rights streak, as part of the American character really since the founding. And I think a lot of folks, particularly on the left, but I think I would also make this argument myself, is that has been so endemic and so ingrained in this country. And while there's no question that racism is tied to that, it's not exclusive to it. If you look at what happened, let's just say in World War I, for example, we get things like the Espionage Act, we get the Sedition Act, we get the Food Control Act. The Food Control Act, by the way, does not get the kind of press that I believe that it should, because this is the law that allowed federal agents, specifically the Secret Service, which was tasked with doing this, to go into people's homes to find out if they had more sugar or butter or whatever than they were being allowed by the federal government. So we've had these often fairly lengthy phases, essentially, of the core concepts of the Bill of Rights essentially being under siege. And I think, a lot of scholars would argue, and I would certainly argue, that for the most part, the Bill of Rights really did not have any kind of meaningful effectuation in any real sense, legally or politically, until the dawn of the 20th century. And then it was really a struggle, essentially, especially for folks on the left, anarchist, socialist, and others, but also the women's rights movement, the suffragette movement, to get any kind of traction, against that prevailing politico-economic paradigm that had been extant for so long. And it's that paradigm, in many respects, frankly, that we're still living with, and essentially trying to find ways to get past. What I worry about right now, maybe more than anything else, even in some respects more than this Trump presidency, which is about to end, is that, as everyone on this panel knows, as I'm sure that many of our listeners and our viewers know right now, is that when we actually turn over to the new year, we will be approaching the 20th anniversary of the attacks on this country, the 9/11 attacks. We'll be approaching the 20th anniversary on October 23rd, 2001, of the passage of the Patriot Act. Easily the most radical, sweeping, and completely ineffectual piece of national security legislation, maybe in the history of the Republic. And I fear, and this is what I worry about most, is that we've now had an entire generation of young people grow up under this law. They have only known a surveillance state. They have only known this. They don't have any sense, really. They didn't grow up in an era when this kind of surveillance was not absolutely, utterly ubiquitous. And I think that's what I worry about above all else, is the normalization of this. And that goes really, I think, to what Shahid was talking about in his opening remarks here, about the Bill of Rights now being essentially kind of reduced to an aspirational set of principles that ultimately, because of the failure of the courts and the ridiculous level of deference that most federal judges have shown to executive branch officials, particularly in a national security related context, simply doesn't have the kind of force that it should. Which is why gatherings like this and the ongoing work of Defending Rights Dissent and other organizations is absolutely critical to begin to kind of change that dynamic.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. There's a lot of threads there, and I think you've predicted some of my next questions. But I guess what I would follow up on is that, and I would just say that, I mean, the ubiquitous of the surveillance state has a real impact. I know that in activist spaces, people will only half jokingly say, like, oh, the FBI must be here, or oh, the police must be here, and that people have sort of accepted this idea that if you have a political media of a certain nature, right, the FBI is probably there, and it creates this sort of paralysis that if we just accept that FBI surveillance of racial justice movements or whatever movement you're in is the norm, people don't really feel like there's a lot they can do about it, right? Like, one of the things that's required for people to take social change is first they have to believe that things can change, and then they have to believe that their actions can change them. And a lot of people don't believe either of those two things. And, I don't want to say there's good reason for it, but it's understandable. So I guess, Shahid, I'm going to put you on the spot, given your sort of depiction of the Bill of Rights in the current moment. Why do they still matter then, or do they still matter, given all of the things that you've said?
Absolutely, and I would particularly note the value of aspiration and why aspiration as a principle and pursuit matters. You know, I'm no stranger to it. I won't talk about the campaign I just mounted, but I'm coming in the heels of having challenged an embodiment of institutional authority inspired precisely by principles, including those embodied in the Bill of Rights. And I think that those same principles are ones that drive everything from the movement for Black Lives. You know, when we were in the streets all year and going back, 6 years ago, we were in the streets. I was occupying Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, I recall. I think it was about this time of year in 2014. And to Shannon's point, about how marginalized communities have been dealing with these issues, not recently, but for decades, centuries, in some cases, even before the existence of the Republic, it only suggests this long-standing continuity of the challenge and long-standing continuity of the struggle. And principles animate struggle, and they inspire struggle, and they connect struggle, and they render our struggles timeless. Hopefully not so much, because I do hope that we can establish and secure some rights such that we can go on to seek other principles, perhaps. But I just think that even when principles are in exile, they matter a great deal. And even if they're not effectuated by the courts, and even if they are abandoned by Congress, in my mind, it makes it all the more important for we the people to remember them. The basis for popular legitimacy, for constitutional legitimacy in our republic is the Constitution. And I think that the abandonment of its principles by our institutions is, like crisis, is dual-sided, right? It presents lots of layers of crisis. And in there is an opportunity for we the people to reassert ourselves and make real, once again, I think, our constitutional commitment to one another.
And speaking of exile, I'm really glad that you used that phrase, my friend, because there is one self-imposed exile who's very much on my mind right now, and his name is Edward Snowden.
Yes.
Let me just say again what I've said publicly repeatedly. All charges against Edward Snowden should be dismissed with prejudice immediately. His documents, his travel documents, should be returned to him immediately so he can return to the United States or go wherever he so desires. What Edward Snowden did, contrary to what Devin Nunes and other folks of that particular political persuasion would have you believe, Edward Snowden exposed crimes against the Constitution. He exposed this mass surveillance that's been going on literally for decades. And the only reason that we know about the scope of this, to the extent that we know anything about it, is through his sacrifice. Now, the very fact that he felt that he could not trust existing governmental institutions, not just the executive branch, not just the NSA Inspector General, not just the Intelligence Community Inspector General, but the Congress and the courts, for that matter, to actually give him a fair hearing, that he chose essentially to do what he did. That's an indictment essentially of where things stand today. And I think it does underscore the gravity of the problem that Shahid has described so far, and that some of my colleagues here have described as well. But I do want to get at what Chip was saying here about, and what Shahid's also said about the need for continuing to believe that change is possible, because it is possible. I just want to tell one quick story. A few years ago, this was literally just a year after Snowden went public, a number of groups, and I was a part of this effort during the time that I was still on Capitol Hill, mounted essentially an effort in the House of Representatives to try to basically put an end, at least for a year, to NSA surveillance of the kind that Snowden had exposed. We managed to get 293 votes for that amendment in the House of Representatives. That was a veto override majority that we achieved on the basis of what Ed had made possible through his disclosures. That was sabotaged by the power structure that Shahid has alluded to. And to me, this is yet another major thing that we ought to be concerned about, deeply concerned about. Congressman, soon-to-be former Congressman Justin Amash was on with my Cato colleagues, Aaron Ross Powell and Trevor Burrus, on the libertarianism.org podcast called Free Thoughts, and I highly recommend that. But it was earlier this year that Mr. Amash went on, and I strongly encourage everyone to take a listen to that, because he describes in chapter and verse the kind of corruption that exists in that, the political corruption and the baneful influence of leadership control of money in the House of Representatives, ultimately, in terms of campaign cash, that basically rewards those who go along with the status quo and punishes those who try to challenge the status quo. It's those kinds of power dynamics that stand between us and the ability to actually make the Bill of Rights functional again, vice aspirational.
I think those are all good points. I just want to do two interjections before I turn to Shannon and Emily. I want to give a brief disclaimer, since Shahid mentioned his campaign, which he is free to do on this panel, that Defending Rights in Dissent is a 501c3 nonprofit and therefore is nonpartisan, does not take positions on elections for partisan office. And also, if you want to help Edward Snowden or advocate for a pardon, we have an action alert for you at the end of this hour. Emily, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that maybe Shahid and I are not as far apart as our initial remarks might have made it seem. When I talk about sort of the variation with which various aspects of the Bill of Rights are treated, I had particularly on my mind today, given some recent Supreme Court activity, is that it seems as if the First Amendment, not the First Amendment freedom of expression and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, but the contemporary idea about what it means to freely practice your religion, that seems to be very alive and well in ways that are going to infringe on the rights and the guarantees of equality of a lot of people in the coming years, I'm afraid. And similarly, the Second Amendment, I think, given the new makeup of the Supreme Court, we're going to see that really increase in its robustness and its coverage. And so if only our courts were as willing to champion the principles behind the Fourth Amendment and free expression the way that they are their view of religious freedom and the right to bear arms, then we'd be in a much better place than the one that we are. So I think I agree with what everyone has said. It's important to maintain these principles, to believe in sort of the arc of justice and continue to fight and press for them. I think, but I think with the Bill of Rights, we've got not only the fight to preserve the principles that we think are most important within the Bill of Rights, but to also prevent other aspects of them from being perverted in a way that end up infringing on the rights of minorities and disenfranchised communities.
I want to pick up on and underscore my agreement with Emily's last point about the importance of our ensuring that the Bill of Rights isn't used to abet further oppression. Basically, it is, essentially a morally silent or morally neutral document. And so if we aren't bringing our moral reasoning to our usage of it, we can end up ignoring the real power differentials and the need to uplift and support oppressed communities with these rights. So, for example, what happened in Charlottesville, the defense of white supremacists' right to free speech, people died and communities were terrorized. And yes, by its clear language, the Bill of Rights protects all types of free speech, but who are we going to use our resources to support, and what is the actual need for this document? It is to protect and uplift and support oppressed communities. So I also wanted to agree with, my co-panelist points about this being a document to support aspiration. I also think it validates our self-knowledge about what we as humans and communities deserve, the rights that belong to us. And I think it's very much still relevant. I also think that it's incumbent on us, especially those of us who are lawyers, to recognize how irrelevant, it feels, to many communities who, understandably, individuals and communities who have very little faith in the Constitution to protect their rights for very good reason, have very little faith in the legal community to care about their rights. And so I think it's important that we see it as one tool among many, and to understand the way that it, of course, fits together with other rights, economic, social, cultural rights, but also the ways that oppressed communities themselves view their struggle and what they need to be supported. And oftentimes there's tremendous overlap, right, between what the Bill of Rights seeks to do and what communities are asking for. But we know our job is to listen to and learn from and work with communities rather than to explain to them why this is the document that is their savior, right? So I think it's very relevant, but I think it's one piece of the picture.
Shannon raises a point there that's really important, I think, methodologically, that presses almost at the nature of the Bill of Rights. So we could construe it as a legal document, which would, to some extent, make it, to some extent, exclusively within the domain of lawyers and judges. Or we could construe it as a popular document, a populist document that articulates and enshrines a set of commitments to we, the people of the United States. And to that extent, one thing that Shannon's raising there that I particularly appreciate is the invitation for all people to grip it. It is, yes, a constitutional document. It's a set of amendments to the Constitution, but it is a set of principles that all Americans share and all Americans can support. And I think that recognition that it is not a rarefied instrument, but it is rather a populist one that everybody has a chance to breathe life into and defend, or suffer the loss of together. I think that's a crucial principle as we construe what the thing itself is and the struggle and opportunities before us.
So Shahid, my next question actually was, what has been the role of social movements and civil society groups in defending, upholding, and or strengthening the Bill of Rights, which I feel like you've started to answer.
Yeah, pieces, I think it remains an unfinished struggle, but I see the movement for Black Lives at the moment as one of the most prolific domestic social movements that is making real that praxis of defending constitutional rights from the streets to state legislatures to city councils to the halls of Congress. And that's not a new project, right? That's unfortunately a struggle that has had to recur over and over and over again since, again, before the founding of the Republic. Another movement that I'd particularly flag here is the immigrant rights movement, and the intersection of them. Chip, you made this point in your opening remarks, the movement responding to police violence with itself met with police violence. And
Yes.
Here we see this really interesting, I think, and fascinating metastasis of police abuses. When we were in the streets calling for respect for Black lives, much of the reason we were doing that is because, to Shannon's point earlier, Black lives have been particularly subject to police violence. And as people were stepping out in solidarity with their neighbors, a lot of white people this summer particularly experienced police violence for the first time. And I think that I hope was a radicalizing moment for a great many people who have come to see the empire without its mask on. For a lot of people, the privileges that we inhabit, whether educational or demographic, economic, might shield us from any number of the vagaries of the system. But it is in precisely those moments where people with privilege encounter the indefensible acts of the institutions that we tacitly support that I think emerges this opportunity for actual destabilization and change to happen. And I think the movement for Black Lives, the immigrant rights movement, and then the movement just to defend dissent that emerged from each of their respective responses from authorities are all ones that I see as examples under our feet of that principle of popular constitutionalism.
You made a lot of good points. I want to follow up on two of them. One about the white people who joined in the Black Lives Matter protest and experienced police brutality. I feel like something very similar happened with Occupy Wall Street. I was in college during Occupy Wall Street, and I visited Zuccotti Park a number of times. And I do remember that movement faced a lot of police brutality, a lot of police violence. I believe the National Lawyers Guild alleged that their legal observers were even targeted by the police. One legal observer had their arm broken with a motorcycle. There was a Iraq War veteran in Oakland who was shot in the head with a projectile by police. And what I noted after that was there was a big conversation by many participants in that movement about police brutality, and a lot of them went out and took part in movements against stop and frisk and gave life to what eventually became the Black Lives Matter. I think there's a real convergence there that a lot of scholars or journalists haven't picked up on, so I appreciate you making that point. I also think your point about popular constitutionalism is really good. I wrote a piece on the anniversary of Eugene Debs' trial for Jacobin. They gave it the title "Free Speech is a Left-Wing Value." It's not a title I would have picked. It doesn't really reflect what the article is about. But one of the things I talked about was how Eugene Debs' trial, Eugene Debs was a socialist leader who was sent to jail for opposing World War I, is considered a huge milestone in the free speech movement. At every level of the courts, he lost. He lost at the trial level, he lost at the appellate level, he lost at the Supreme Court, and part of it was this sort of World War I panic, but the courts at that time were extremely hostile to the rights we would come to think of as being protected by the First Amendment, right? It's not until the 1930s that they even ruled that freedom of assembly means you can go into a public park or public street and gather for political purposes. But the people, not the judges or the lawyers, but the people found this very offensive and odious, and they organized a movement to free Eugene Debs. There was also wider movements to free labor activists who had been attacked by police, as well as World War I protesters, and they sort of asserted their own theory of freedom of speech that I know many historians will note was not a legal theory at all. And while they lost in the courts during this time period, their view of freedom of speech became hegemonic, and it's the view the courts accept today, right? So we do have ways to enforce or reinterpret or correctly interpret for the first time, however you want to view it, the Bill of Rights, beyond just what 5 people on the Supreme Court say it does or does not stand for.
Well, and kind of to the point that you opened this particular segment up on, Chip, with respect to, groups that have really had an impact. I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the incredible role that our colleagues at the American Civil Liberties Union have played over the course of the last century in making a lot of these very things possible. And I'm thinking especially about the late Roger Baldwin, the first real full-time executive director of the ACLU, when he was called before the Fish Committee, one of the first of what I will call the Congressional Witch Hunt Committees. In 1930, in which he was basically asked, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is pretty close, where essentially did he draw the line with respect to speech? And his, Baldwin's standard was basically, look, when it crosses over from speech into violent action, that's when I think you basically kind of, lose a protection. And that standard would actually go on to become the standard that the Supreme Court would adopt in 1968. In the Ohio,
Brandenburg.
Yes, yeah, Brandenburg v. Ohio case, and then that's why I do think that it is important for us, to recognize the centrality of protecting essentially the purity of the intent really behind the First Amendment. I'll go back to the Alien and Sedition Acts, just very briefly to kind of make that point. But it's still relevant today. I mean, this was a case where, of course, you had an entire administration basically try to use the power of the federal government to silence its critics. And I think we have to be very, very cautious and very concerned about, having the federal government ever get in the role, essentially, of picking sides about whose speech is appropriate and not. And I think, for me, I just kind of hearken back to the example that another ACLU executive director, Ira Glasser, who is currently the subject of a great documentary called Mighty Ira, looking at his tenure at the ACLU. When that Skokie case came up in the 1970s, they weren't sure that they wanted to take it on to begin with, but Ira made the case that, look, we're either for protecting everybody's speech or we're not for protecting anybody's speech. And that's very much the way that I come at these things. That does not mean for a single minute that I think that it's acceptable to let the kinds of things that led to Charlottesville go unchallenged. But I do think we have to be very careful about advocating policies that would begin to, give a political tint of any kind, essentially, to the First Amendment. It has to be neutral, and it has to basically respect the ability of people to speak their minds. It's when folks decide to pick up guns and start trying to impose their will on other people that I think, we have to be willing to draw the line there and basically say, no, that's not part of the democratic process.
And the position Defending Rights and Dissent takes as an organization is the one that Pat just articulated. We support the right of all people, no matter how loathsome or unloathsome their speech is, to participate freely and oppose any sort of state-mandated content or viewpoint restrictions on speech. If people are interested in the early history of the ACLU in the 20th century, as well as the development of modern free speech and civil liberties discourse, I highly recommend the book, The Taming of Free Speech, America's Civil Liberties Compromise. I promise I'm not just showing off my new bookshelf by doing this, by Laura Weinrib. It's really influenced my own thinking. It talks not just about the history of the ACLU, but how civil liberties came to be accepted in this country. I believe in the Wall Street Journal's review of it, they said, today we think of civil liberties as American as apple pie, but there was a time in the 20th century people didn't even agree, did the Constitution protect them? How'd that come to be? And she has a bit of a controversial thesis about a compromise that allowed that to happen, but I think whether you accept that or not, her book is quite illuminating. Shannon, do you want to jump in?
I do, because I think Pat's remarks are probably quite relevant to my prior remarks, and I think it's always most interesting when these panels have a little bit of attention in them. I would actually agree very much with Pat about the danger of government interference in subject matter restrictions or viewpoint restrictions on the First Amendment. I do not in any way trust the government to make those value judgments. And in fact, even with the First Amendment in place, of course, they are constantly trying to do so, to criminalize certain types of speech. They do so in particular in the national security context, but not only in the national security context, in terms of, attempting to characterize certain types of speech as material support, for example, material support for terrorism. I think, I'm not sure that I disagree with Pat on this point, but I think an element that I really wanted to surface when I mentioned Charlottesville is that, we have choices in terms of which communities we are most concerned about uplifting, right? And I understand the need to defend speech of unpopular actors in order to protect that right across the board and really to prevent government incursions and government abuses. But we also have our own resources, of time, of money. Certainly in the private sector, companies can make determinations about who they provide a platform or who they deplatform. And I think there's a risk that if we carry over the requirements that we make, that really the government is held to in terms of respect for free speech, regardless of the content, regardless of the viewpoint, provided it doesn't incite imminent violence, then we don't challenge the degree that we should these types of really horrific types of speech that do terrorize people. It's not only the physical violence, it is the suggestions that communities not exist. It is the encouragement to genocide, right? Even if it's not imminent incitement of violence, these types of speech do harm. And so we have, that does not mean that it's the government's job to interfere necessarily in those cases, but it is, as a society, our job to bring our moral compass to that and consider where we lend our support and where we don't.
Strongly agree.
Could I jump in here with a reference to CDA?
Of course.
This isn't constitutional, and it's not exactly the Bill of Rights, but it's a demonstration of how constitutional principles get implicated in seemingly routine or mundane policy conversations. So just to set this up, Communications Decency Act, Section 230, it's very controversial, and it's the subject of the current reform effort on Capitol Hill, ironically supported by some of the same tech giants that have impeded Section 230 reform in the past. I just want to make the point here that 230 basically allows liability protection for corporate platforms such that the content that users post to, for instance, Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, or you name the platform, that the corporate platforms are not liable for the speech generated by their users. And the current reform effort is positing that that somehow represents a subsidy to corporate interest when it ultimately keeps companies from, it's a protection to discourage companies from wading into the content moderation stream. And I totally respect Shannon's point about bringing our morals to the debate about what voices a private platform might choose to deplatform. But I also would just note that setting aside those kinds of cases that are ones I think that many of us can agree around, that also presents this challenge. Once we allow companies to be held responsible, as they currently are under SESTA and FOSTA in some cases, for user-generated speech, it's not the companies that are put at risk, it's the users, because it then puts the companies between them and their avenues for speech. And so this isn't constitutional because it's not state action, but it absolutely implicates speech and its capacity to influence the public discourse, particularly at this time in history as digital platforms, particularly during the pandemic, have come to represent so much of our cultural discourse. And so I just want to note how the First Amendment's principles are implicated in the CDA 230 debate, and how a commitment to constitutionalism might suggest some deference to the existing landscape there, and some reticence before placing everyone's opportunity to use the internet at the mercy of companies trying to guard their own pocketbooks from liability.
Yeah, I think Emily, go on.
I was just going to say, at the same time, I think it's impossible to have the free speech conversation without talking about the role of these platforms, that becomes quite complicated because, as Shahid says, they're not state actors, and so they're not bound by the Constitution, but they do sort of disrupt the basis on which some of the constitutional principles are founded. So, for example, the idea under the First Amendment is that everyone gets to say what they have to say, and in the end, the best ideas will win the debate. They'll win the day, and bad ideas will fall by the wayside. And I think that in the current media environment, it's so easy for people to prevent themselves from hearing any ideas that are different from their own, that it's really the whole sort of marketplace of ideas theory behind the First Amendment. It doesn't really work in those sort of electronic marketplaces where people pick and choose what ideas can come their way. And so I don't pretend to have an answer for this. It's just more of a sort of foot stomp on Shahid's point that when we talk about these things, what we say about what the platforms can and can't do and should and shouldn't do, it's really complicated and really hard, and we need to think as a society about what sort of role we want them to be able to play.
And we've seen sort of a convergence of both social media and government censorship recently, with an issue where a number of colleges have tried to have classroom discussions or online seminars inviting a very famous member of the Palestinian Popular Front Liberation of Palestine, which is on the State Department foreign terrorist organization list, but just inviting her for a classroom discussion. And sort of NGOs that are interested in censoring certain discussions about the Middle East have written to Zoom and actually blocked colleges and classrooms from using the platform for these discussions. And the effect was that other schools scheduled the same speaker, and Zoom blocked them as well. And Zoom's claim is that they can't allow this person to speak because they would violate the material support for terrorism statute. And most civil liberties attorneys said, no, that's not true. And I think in a lot of ways, Zoom is probably hiding behind that as a fig leaf. But it's an example of, schools are doing online social distancing or online learning, including public universities. They are having their conversations and classroom discussions over Zoom. This is a private company, and they are flat out saying, if you invite this person to speak, we will not allow you to have your class. And they are doing this in conjunction in part with these sorts of private groups. And I think Pat knows this from his research. There's always been this historical trend where there's been these sorts of private groups do their own intelligence, do their own blacklisting, and they give that information to, in this case, corporations, but in many other cases, state actors who then act on it. So this is, I think, a really big issue, and I don't think there's an easy fix for how we deal with it. But I do think it is a discussion we're going to be having more and more.
Well, this entire issue of essentially corporate intelligence being for sale to Customs and Border Protection, to FBI, to DEA, this is a major loophole as far as I'm concerned. Of course, Senator Wyden has got a bill now, which of course we cannot take a position on this particular broadcast, but it's got a bill out there that is designed, to try to get at this problem, to some degree. But I will tell you that I hear from some of my conservative friends who actually take shots at me and some others saying, you guys are always talking about, how bad NSA is. Why aren't you talking about Palantir? Why aren't you talking about Google? I do talk about them. Believe me, I talk about them. But it's something that I do think we're going to have to really take a very close look at in terms of how this gets addressed in a First Amendment and just a general Bill of Rights, especially Fourth Amendment kind of context, because the amount of data that is generated essentially. And I will tell you, if you're out there and you're wondering, is Eddington on Facebook? The answer is no. And I will never be on Facebook, and my friends all know why that is. But Facebook, essentially, in my judgment, is the largest single commercial surveillance platform on the planet. And I think that's one of the things that we really do have to wrestle with, because it is, as Chip has indicated, it's incredibly easy, particularly under the Patriot Act, but also through the use of things like national security letters. For the feds, to get just an enormous amount of data on us, and they don't have to go to the FISA court necessarily to get everything that they want. And I think that's a real loophole. It's a real problem that we have to kind of wrestle with here. I don't know that I have, a clean answer to it either, quite frankly. Kind of going back to Emily's point, but I'm deeply concerned about it.
I have to say, but I find it quite amusing that you mentioned your conservative friends are always telling you, why aren't you talking about Google? Why aren't you talking about Palantir?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the left make that same critique of civil liberties advocacy, that you're always focusing on the state, but what about these private actors who are, equally bad or doing their own thing? So the
difference, of course, is that Google does not have people with badges and guns who can break down your door in the middle of the night. And that is the point that I make to my conservative friends whenever they come and, say, hey, aren't these guys and gals bad actors too? And I'm not going to dispute that in my judgment, they are oftentimes. The only social media company, there are only two social media companies that I can think of in the last 10 years that really tried to push back on a lot of this stuff. Twitter is one of them, which is why I am on Twitter. Yeah. But I was on Capitol Hill when the whole SOPA debate took place, when Aaron Karp still controlled Tumblr. I will tell you that as a staffer, I never had to write so many constituent letters in my entire life after he went on his platform and told his followers, they're going to take your Tumblr away from you if you don't let them know that that's not what you want. They shut down Capitol Hill switchboard. Our email virtually crashed because of what Aaron Karp did that day. So don't let anybody tell you that advocacy can't make a difference when it's properly organized, when it's properly directed, and when it's led by somebody that people respect. It can have an enormous impact. It can have a tremendous impact. And we need something like that clearly to happen again in this case.
So let's go to a more upbeat question, although I think the last one was upbeat as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, and I think everyone knows, the year of 2020 has been a little bit bleak, to put it mildly. As a champion of the Bill of Rights, what is something from this year that has inspired you? A positive thing.
I'd point to the Justice and Policing Act, though I've also been very critical of it. It was a bill passed by the House this summer that did a great many things. It included parts of the End Racial Profiling Act, which have been on the congressional cutting room floor for years. It also, unfortunately, would expand both police budgets and surveillance. But that notwithstanding, it would at least address, or it would do, among other things, limiting qualified immunity for police officers who kill on the job. It would enable the collection of data about racial impacts of police behavior to allow the empirical verification of claims about potential profiling. So there's big steps forward alongside some disappointing steps back. But just to see the House, and in particular some House members who've never been fans of police reform, step forward for fairly aggressive police reform relative to Congress's longstanding historical pattern, that I found to be an inspiring reflection, not just of the responsiveness of institutions, but going back to our previous theme of the grassroots activism that forced the hands of policymakers to finally show up for work. And I hope to see us do more of that going forward.
Facial recognition bans, no question about it. What we've seen in the Bay Area and some other areas has really given me a great deal of hope. I don't know whether outright bans are the complete answer. The reason I favor them for the foreseeable future is because we know that as a general rule, whether it's law enforcement at the federal, state, or local level, if you give them a tool, they will abuse it. They will abuse it. 100% of the time, no exceptions, they will abuse it. So I don't think there's any question that an overall pause on the use, not just of facial recognition, but of biometric technology generally, which Customs and Border Protection and DHS especially are doing their best to try to ram down the throats of immigrant communities, especially, and immigrant rights activists as well. The pushback on that has been very encouraging to me. I hope we see a lot more of that going into 2021, and I hope the incoming administration is actually listening on this issue.
And the Defending Rights and Dissent official position is in support of total bans. People are not allowed to dissent from the official position on this broadcast. I just wanted to let the viewers at home know that we are for total bans. Emily, what's inspired you this year?
So for me, I guess I would point back to the protests over the summer. As we were talking about earlier, constitutional interpretation is not something that happens only in the courts. This is something that belongs to the people, and constitutional change in our interpretation of what the Constitution permits and what it demands has changed over time as the views of the American people change, and they make those views known, and they insist on interpreters of the Constitution listening to those views. And so I think when you have a movement like the Black Lives Matter that really transcend particular communities and cut across so much of American life, and really reach out to and inspire people from very different places, different socioeconomic statuses, different races, etc. When you can bring that kind of coalition together and demand change, that's when change happens.
And Shannon.
I hate to be unoriginal, but I'm going to agree with Emily. First of all, I really agree with Pat's point about facial surveillance bans. This is not something I would have expected to see a year ago, and I think the degree of progress there is really exciting. But it may be perhaps a somewhat obvious answer, but I'm also very moved and inspired by the mass mobilizations this year, just the continued capacity for outrage and the feeling of responsibility that so many of us have for one another. The length of time that those protests persisted in the face of a pandemic and of outrageous state violence, police being stationed in the streets, is very inspiring to me. And, I tend to be a pessimist, and so we'll look at the side that says, well, for how long did, white people in particular stand by Black communities and really demand that their actual demands were met, and not try to, direct messaging to, say, well, defund police doesn't really mean defund police. Here's what I think you meant to say, right? It's very easy to say that we did not take full advantage of that moment, but that moment is continuing, and it's hard not to be inspired by just the degree of responsibility that folks felt for one another and the risk that they were willing to take. And I really hope that we can see it continue to grow in the coming year.
I think the protests have been what inspired me as well. I live in DC, and there was the night where Trump called in the National Guard, and I was sitting in my apartment. You could hear helicopters flying over, and it was extremely depressing evening. And then the next day, people came out in the streets in larger numbers than the day before. And then the next day, more people came out. And, while there is a history of white supremacy in this country and racism, there's also a really rich history of multiracial working class organization for justice around the fight to free the Scottsboro Boys, around many of the big struggles that we think about historically. And I think this is a really inspiring moment where we see those types of mobilizations and we see that type of organizing from below. And I've been extremely inspired by the protest in response to the George Floyd.
Can I offer a story that connects a couple different points in our conversation?
Offer any story you want, Sean.
Well, so this will go back to the very beginning of the show. The opening song, Spying Eyes, featured our board member, Mike Rufo. And you, Chip, were talking about Occupy and how it presaged some of the dynamics that we're seeing more recently. And you particularly mentioned the night at Occupy Oakland when Iraq War veteran Scott Olson went to the hospital in a coma when the Alameda County Sheriff's Department managed to send a veteran who made it home from serving his country in armed service abroad, only to be sent to the hospital by a domestic police department for the crime of raising his voice, as he's constitutionally entitled to do. That was the night that Mike Rufo and I met. We met by Oakland a few hours after Scott had been shot, and we were reading the First Amendment to the riot cops that night at Occupy Oakland. And to see, it's 10 years later, and we're on the board of this organization together, and I see in those mobilizations a chance not only to articulate and to demonstrate and to challenge, but also to connect and to organize and to mobilize and to build. And that's another thing that I've certainly been inspired by this year, is all the building that's been happening in all the different places.
Upton Sinclair did something quite similar, during a labor strike. He read the First Amendment aloud and then was subsequently arrested. Then he went on to found his local ACLU chapter. So, it's a positive ending in the story. But as you were telling that, I was wondering if you were aware of Upton Sinclair's similar.
I hadn't heard that, but thanks for sharing it.
It ended better for you than it did for him, it sounds like. So, final question of the evening is that on this day, we are supposed to engage in mobilizations for human rights and for freedom, which at Defending Rights and Dissent, we actually do every day, not just on December the 15th. What are some ways people can take action to support the Bill of Rights that you would recommend them? If they're sitting at home right now and they're feeling inspired by this panel and they want to get out in the streets or in their city hall or halls of Congress, wherever they want to go and support the Bill of Rights, what are some actions you'd recommend? And I will end with an action alert from DRAD at the end, but just hear the panel.
Well, let me just jump in real quick here and say thanks, Chip, for bringing us all together to do this tonight. And if you've been watching this and you have found this discussion to be informative, if you have found it to be of value, if you have found anything about it inspirational, then let me take this opportunity to ask you to make a contribution to Defending Rights and Dissent. Our ability to bring this information to you, to bring this kind of programming to you, is absolutely dependent upon the support that we get from folks out there that agree with us, that believe, as we do, that the Bill of Rights is our secular scripture, that it is our guiding light, essentially, and it informs everything that we try to do in this organization. So if you want to help make a difference, please consider a contribution to this organization. We do a lot to support a number of grassroots groups around the country with direct financial support, with direct staff support. In order to be able to continue to do that and to up our game, we need your help. So, when this thing is over, go to our website, do what you can to make a donation, and please make sure that you share the link of this broadcast, of this particular program, with as many of your friends, family members, anybody else who you think also believes, as we do, as we hope you do, that the Bill of Rights is something that is worth fighting for. Thanks.
Thank you, Pat.
I can offer a suggestion here. I mean, just to a quick 30-second advocacy primer. If the discussion about face surveillance in particular that Pat and Shannon shared is something that inspires you, one way you can promote that campaign and help nudge your city towards defending your rights and the rights of your neighbors is just to write a letter and circulate it among your neighbors. And if you just sign a letter together and send it to each of the people who represents you in government, you might find yourself surprised at how many meetings you can get. That can create opportunities to propose limits, to find out how you can be helpful, to connect to other groups that might have similar demands. Getting together with your neighbors to articulate your concerns in concert can unlock an array of opportunities. And that's something in particular I'm always eager to invite people to do.
Yeah, I think one of the great developments of recent years is that a lot of people have gotten much more involved in public policy and politics and advocating for the issues that they care about. And the result of that is there are a number of wonderful groups. Almost every local community has advocacy groups of some kind. Defending Rights and Dissent supports many of them. Some of them are focused on particular issues. And so if there's an issue that you feel particularly passionate about, I think a little bit of digging around in your local community would probably put you in touch with other people who are like-minded and who are working on those issues and give you an opportunity to get involved in your local community.
Emily, very similar to my suggestion, which is not so much on a substantive topic, but just about the importance of doing what you can at your local level to try to affect change, because it's, as you know, we know it's often much easier to make change in your locality, even your state, than at the federal level. And yet those local policy changes really can help educate the public and can really influence statewide and nationwide change. The facial surveillance bans, of course, being one example. Some localities pulling out of joint terrorism task forces, localities looking to defund police. Sorry, I should have said what I meant to say was defund police. I shouldn't say that. But all that's just to say that you can often have an impact at the local level. You can also get to know your local representatives in a way that you may not have the opportunity at the federal level. As Emily said, there's so many great organizations working in that area that it is important to find out who's in that space so that you're not trying to reinvent the wheel and so that you're building power together. Along those lines, I also just really want to appreciate and second what Pat said about supporting Defending Rights and Dissent. One of the most impressive things to me about this organization is how it supports grassroots communities in so many different areas, working on so many different issues around the country. I used to be the executive director of a small, scrappy grassroots organization that I co-founded, Muslim Justice League, and was always completely supported by and amazed by the support of such a small but really impactful organization, Defending Rights and Dissent. And I know that they still continue to play that role for Muslim Justice League and many others. So make a donation, even just learn about our work, listen to Chip's amazing podcast, Still Flying. There's so many ways to learn about and support this organization.
So I'm also going to ask everyone, if they can, to make a donation to Defending Rights and Dissent. You can do so if you log on to rightsanddissent.org/donate. We do a lot of work on a lot of issues. You'd be surprised how many things we work on for a small group. We have been fighting for years the use of the Espionage Act against whistleblowers. We've organized the first protest in defense of Chelsea Manning. We have been organizing for decades against FBI political surveillance. And last year we put out a report documenting FBI political surveillance in the last 10 years. At the beginning of the year, I went to New York and DC to give public talks about the report. Obviously, we cannot do that because of COVID, but we've since produced a podcast that has brought together a really impressive array of academic historians, journalists, activists, advocates across generations who have worked on the FBI issue. And I don't think there's any other audio source that has compiled together all of these different distinguished experts in their fields in one place. So I would really implore you to donate at rightsandDissent.org/donate. We've also been working to defend the right to protest. That's always been one of our core issues. And with the backlash, unfortunately, against the racial justice protest, we're expecting a lot more attacks on racial justice protesters. So please, if you can, I know it's a recession and times are hard, to go to rightsandDissent.org/donate. And even if you can't donate, we have an action alert we want to urge you to take tonight. Whistleblowers, journalists, and other truth tellers have been essential to exposing abuses of fundamental rights, helping to make sure they are not lost forever. Yet the United States government has treated brave whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, who exposed unconstitutional surveillance, as spies, charging them on the draconian Espionage Act. And now the US government has gone a step further, seeking the extradition of an Australian publisher, Julian Assange, for publishing information about US war crimes and abuses of power. With Assange and drone whistleblower Daniel Hale currently facing prosecution, reality winner and FBI whistleblower Terry Albury currently in prison, and Snowden living in exile, all for the crime of exposing official misconduct, we have to ask ourselves, what is the present meaning and living worth of our cherished Bill of Rights? That's why we are asking you to join us in a mobilization for freedom and for human rights and in defense of those who tell the truth. Presidents, in their last days in office, traditionally pardon or commute the sentences of many people. Obama, in one of his final acts, commuted the sentence of whistleblower Chelsea Manning. He should have given her a full pardon, but he gave her a commutation, and we took that. We need you to call on Donald Trump right now to pardon all of those indicted or convicted under the Espionage Act for giving information to the media about abuses of power or for publishing about those abuses of power. If you go to rightsandDissent.org/take action right now, you will get the page that will allow you, with just entering a little bit of information, to contact the White House with a message calling for him to pardon these brave whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are not spies, they are not criminals, they are heroes, and it is obscene in this country that we continue to charge and try them under the Espionage Act, and in the case of Snowden, hound a patriot out of this country. On that note, I want to thank all of my panelists for joining me for what has been a really provocative and thought-provoking discussion. I know I'm going to be thinking a lot about what people have said for the next of the week or so, and I suspect we could have been here all night, but I will mercifully let you all go.
Great to be with you all.
Thanks,
Have a
Chip.
great night, everyone.
Thanks,
Keep up the good
folks.
work.
Good night.
See you. Have a good night.
Well, the NSA sure seemed to find out early how to open our files without a key. They didn't let the Constitution bother them, or the Fourth Amendment's right to privacy. No, they just set out on their dragnet, grabbing all the data they could see. And Google, Facebook, and AT&T went right along without telling you or me. They can't hide their spying eyes and their smiles have been disguised. DRAD led us into the corners of your mind. Now you don't have to worry, you can trust us. Just don't be thinking thoughts we find unkind. But my oh my, they sure know how to scare us, convince us to give up our liberty. But old Ben Franklin got it right the first time. He said, don't give it up for false security. Now the government says they're ready to debate us about files of prism and whether we're still free. But we know there wouldn't be much to discuss without Edward Snowden's love for his country. They can't